A century of medical research separates us from the trenches of the First World War, and doctors are still finding new answers to the same question. How did artillery actually kill people? Not the obvious answer, shrapnel, fragmentation, direct impact. The other answer, the one that explains why soldiers were found dead with blood seeping from their ears and noses, their uniforms intact, their bodies showing not a single wound. From the outside, they looked like men who had simply sat down and stopped. From the inside, their organs had been destroyed by something that left no trace on the skin. This wasn't rare. A substantial portion of artillery deaths on the Western Front produced no external injuries whatsoever. No entry wound, no bruising, no evidence that anything had touched them. Something invisible had passed through these men, moving faster than their nervous systems could detect it, and it had killed them as thoroughly as any bullet. Understanding exactly what that something was, what it does to tissue, why certain organs fail while others survive, and why the medical community took decades to piece together the mechanism, requires starting with the physics of an explosion itself. Most people, confronted with an artillery detonation, focus on the fragment cloud, superheated metal dispersing outward at lethal velocity. That's real and it's devastating, but it's only part of the picture. Every detonation simultaneously produces a pressure wave, a wall of compressed atmosphere that radiates outward from the point of explosion at speeds exceeding 6,800 meters per second. That's more than 20 times the speed of sound. Commercial aircraft cruise at a small fraction of that. Even dedicated supersonic military jets barely manage twice the speed of sound. This pressure wave, completely invisible, producing no sound of its own, arriving before any sensation of the explosion itself, can stop a heart and collapse a lung without making contact with a single external surface of the body. To understand what it does, you need to understand what an explosion actually is at a physical level. When a high explosive initiates, the chemical transformation from solid or liquid to superheated gas happens in microseconds. The gas produced reaches temperatures between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius and has nowhere to go except outward. That violent expansion is what generates the pressure wave, an almost instantaneous jump in atmospheric pressure from the standard 14.7 pounds per square inch to potentially hundreds of pounds per square inch. The leading edge of the wavefront, is only about an inch thick, but the energy compressed into that inch is enough to destroy a human body from the inside without touching the outside. Here is the detail that changes everything about how this injury works. Pressure waves travel faster through denser materials. In open air, sound moves at roughly 340 meters per second. Through water, the same energy travels at 1,500 meters per second, more than 4 times faster. The human body is approximately 60% water, so when a blast wave makes contact, it doesn't decelerate, it accelerates. It drives deeper into tissue faster than it was moving through air, and it does so before any sensory signal warning of the explosion has had time to reach the brain. What the wave does next depends entirely on which type of tissue it encounters, because the human body is not a uniform medium. It contains 3 fundamentally different categories of material, each responding to sudden pressure in its own way. Dense, solid organs like the liver and kidneys transmit pressure relatively uniformly. The wave moves through them without creating large internal differentials. There's cellular disruption, but solid organs are far from the most vulnerable. Blood-filled structures, the heart, the major vessels, behave similarly. Blood is largely incompressible, so pressure moves through it smoothly, the way it moves through water. The cardiovascular system survives blast overpressure better than almost anything else in the body. And then there are air-filled organs, the lungs, the intestines. These are where blast waves do their worst work. Air compresses, tissue doesn't. When a pressure wave hits a boundary between compressible air and incompressible tissue or fluid, it creates shear forces, violent mechanical stress concentrated exactly at that interface. The organ that bears the worst of this is the lung. Each lung is a structure of extraordinary delicacy, millions of tiny air sacs called alveoli, their walls one cell thick, wrapped in a network of capillaries that are also one cell thick. These are the structures where oxygen crosses from air into blood. When a blast wave reaches the chest wall, it passes through muscle and bone with relative ease. The moment it reaches the lungs, it hits the air tissue boundary, and the pressure differential tears those one-cell thick walls apart. Thousands of alveoli rupture in less time than a heartbeat takes to complete. Capillaries burst. Blood floods into spaces designed for air. Air escapes into spaces designed for blood. The architecture of the lung is functionally destroyed by forces it was never built to withstand, in a time frame too short for any physical response to intervene. What makes this injury so dangerous is its deceptive presentation. A soldier can walk away from a blast that has just destroyed his lungs. He might feel shaken, short of breath, perhaps functional, but functional, conscious, able to respond to questions. Meanwhile, inside the chest, hemorrhage into the alveoli is progressing without any mechanism to stop it. Air continues escaping into the chest cavity in a condition called pneumothorax, compressing the lung from the outside inward. The available surface area for oxygen exchange shrinks with every passing minute. No field intervention reverses this. The soldier is dying, and he may be the last person in his vicinity to know it. This is the part that completely baffled First World War medical officers. They saw men who showed up ambulatory and alert, were assessed as uninjured, and died hours later. Some physicians concluded the cause was psychological, that the stress of combat was somehow producing cardiac arrest. Others believed the blast had physically disrupted the brain's control over autonomic functions. A few came close to the truth without quite reaching it. The real mechanism would remain unclear for years after the armistice. Beyond the lungs, the intestines present the same basic problem in a slightly more resilient package. The gut is never empty of gas, and when a pressure wave crosses the abdomen, that gas compresses sharply, while the surrounding intestinal wall does not. The shear forces this produces are somewhat less catastrophic than in the lungs. Intestinal tissue is thicker and tougher than alveolar membranes, but the damage is real and frequently fatal on a delayed timeline. Blood vessels in the intestinal wall tear at a microscopic scale. Blood seeps into the tissue, swelling follows. In more severe cases, the bowel perforates entirely, and the contents of the digestive tract, bacteria included, enter the abdominal cavity. The resulting infection, in the early 20th century, was nearly universally fatal. Even without perforation, the bruised and hemorrhaging intestinal tissue created conditions that killed soldiers days after the initial blast, from causes their physicians couldn't identify and had no tools to address. The variables that determine injury severity are less intuitive than most people assume. Distance is the obvious one, but the geometry of the space around the soldier matters as much. In open terrain, a blast wave passes through a body once and continues outward, losing energy as it spreads. In an enclosed space, the wave reflects. It bounces off walls, floors, and ceilings, and returns from multiple directions, each reflected wave delivering another overpressure dose to the same body, potentially from a completely different angle. An enclosure doesn't just contain a blast. It turns a single pressure event into a sustained assault. Soldiers sheltering in dugouts during heavy bombardments were sometimes worse off than men in the open, because a shell detonating near an entrance would send pressure waves channeling through the entire underground structure, bouncing off every surface, compounding with each reflection. Body orientation produces measurable differences in outcome, though it seems almost too subtle to matter given the timescales involved. A soldier facing the blast exposes the full surface area of both lungs to the incoming wave. A soldier standing sideways presents a smaller cross-section. The mortality data shows this distinction reliably. The difference is real, even if no soldier in the middle of a bombardment is calculating their optimal orientation. One of the most counterintuitive findings in blast injury research concerns the relationship between distance and survivability. Proximity to a detonation is not always the most dangerous position. Very close to the explosion, the pressure spike is extreme. The positive pressure phase lasts only a fraction of a millisecond. Tissue is hit hard, but for so short a duration that the cumulative mechanical stress may be survivable. At moderate distance, peak pressure is lower, but the positive pressure phase extends longer. Organs are compressed for more total time, and the accumulated damage can be worse. German artillery spotters noticed this pattern in the field without being able to explain it. Men found alive 10 feet from a crater, men found dead 30 feet away. They called it fortune. The physics had a more precise explanation. The eardrum is the body's most pressure-sensitive structure by a significant margin, and understanding why helps explain one of the major diagnostic failures of the war. The membrane is designed to detect the smallest possible variations in air pressure, optimized for sensitivity in a way that makes it catastrophically vulnerable to overpressure. As little as 7 to 8 pounds per square inch can rupture it, well below the 15 pounds per square inch required to seriously damage the lungs. The membrane tears at its attachment points, blood runs from the ear canal, hearing fails temporarily or permanently. This is, paradoxically, one of the more survivable blast injuries. It's painful and disabling, but it doesn't kill. The problem is that it became a proxy diagnostic. If the ears are bleeding, the patient was near a blast. If the ears are intact, the patient seems safer. That logic was fatally incomplete. The thresholds are different enough that a soldier could present with unruptured eardrums and be dying from pulmonary hemorrhage. The field medical system missed fatal injuries in men who passed the informal eardrum check. The brain adds a further complication to the picture. It contains no air, which seemed to imply some protection from pressure differentials. That turned out to be partially correct and, importantly, wrong. The skull is sealed and rigid. When pressure builds inside it, there is no exit. The blast wave drives through the head, the pressure inside the cranium spikes, and the brain, suspended in incompressible cerebrospinal fluid, undergoes rapid acceleration and deceleration. Soft tissue that was stationary is suddenly in motion. Blood vessels stretch, some tear. Unlike the lungs, where the damage is measurable and progressive from the moment of injury, brain damage from blast exposure can remain clinically invisible for hours. A soldier could be carrying a traumatic brain injury severe enough to kill him while appearing completely coherent, answering questions, following orders, reporting for duty. Then the headaches begin, then confusion, speech difficulty follows, coma, seizures. The injury had been present from the moment the wave passed through. The symptoms were simply on a delay that the medical technology of the era couldn't bridge. British medical officers during the Battle of the Somme were among the first to formally categorize this cluster of presentations. They named it blast concussion, though their understanding of the underlying mechanism was incomplete. Theories circulated about cardiac shock, neurological collapse, vagal nerve disruption. The actual picture was more complex than any single system failure. Multiple organ systems degrading simultaneously, each one compounding the others. Hemorrhaging lungs reducing oxygen supply, bruised intestines leaking inflammatory compounds into the bloodstream, swelling brain tissue increasing intracranial pressure, a cardiovascular system oscillating between hypertension and hypotension as it attempted to maintain oxygen delivery to tissues that were progressively less capable of using it. The cascade that follows a serious blast injury runs on a predictable timeline. Lung function begins deteriorating first. Accumulating hemorrhage shrinks the surface area available for gas exchange. Blood oxygen saturation falls. The heart accelerates, increasing cardiac output in an attempt to compensate. But pumping more blood through damaged lungs doesn't fix the lungs. Oxygen levels keep dropping. The body begins rationing circulation, pulling blood away from skin and extremities to protect the brain and heart. The skin becomes pale and cold to the touch. Peripheral sensation fades. The kidneys, deprived of adequate perfusion, start shutting down. Metabolic waste accumulates in the blood, and through all of it, cognition deteriorates as the brain receives progressively less of the oxygen it requires to maintain function. When lung destruction crosses a critical threshold, the patient enters what modern medicine classifies as acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS. The lung tissue stiffens and fills with fluid, until it can no longer move sufficient air to sustain life, regardless of how hard the patient tries to breathe. Today, with mechanical ventilation, aggressive critical care, and prone positioning protocols developed specifically to manage this condition, ARDS still kills between 30 and 40% of patients who develop it. In a forward field hospital in 1916, with none of those tools and no understanding of the underlying process, it was effectively unsurvivable. A soldier who developed ARDS after a blast died. The only variable was how long it took. Triage under these conditions was essentially guesswork. The injuries didn't present proportionally to the exposure. A soldier who had been close and showed obvious distress might recover. A soldier who had been farther back, who felt well enough to stand and speak, might be hours from death from internal hemorrhage no one could detect without equipment that didn't exist in the field. Military surgeons developed a practical rule of thumb. Anyone close enough to a blast to be knocked off their feet should be held under observation for 24 hours, regardless of apparent condition. In practice, during active combat, this was almost never possible. Men were assessed, cleared, returned to their units, and found dead by morning. The invisible injuries progressed, while the visible soldier appeared fine. German military medicine was actually ahead of the Allies in approaching this problem systematically. German doctors identified the pattern of externally unmarked dead clustered near blast sites and began conducting formal post-mortem examinations. What they found was consistent and striking: lung tissue that appeared to have been physically beaten, diffuse hemorrhage throughout, alveolar structure obliterated, and no shrapnel injury to account for any of it. Their findings were published in 1915, but the publications were in German, and they didn't reach Allied medical networks for years. British and French physicians were independently arriving at similar observations, but lacked the conceptual framework to make sense of them. The complete picture emerged only after the war, when researchers began deliberately exposing animal subjects to controlled blast pressures and systematically documenting the resulting pathology. They mapped specific injury types against specific pressure thresholds. Blast lung began at roughly 15 pounds per square inch. Intestinal damage required somewhat more. Eardrum failure happened at lower levels. And across all categories, the duration of the pressure phase proved to matter as much as its peak magnitude. A longer exposure at moderate pressure could equal or exceed the tissue damage from a brief spike at high pressure, which explained why moderate distance casualties sometimes presented worse injuries than soldiers who had been much closer to the detonation. That research reshaped military medical doctrine in ways that are still visible today. Modern medics screening blast casualties follow a checklist that didn't exist in 1917. Examine the eardrums as a blast proximity indicator, monitor respiratory rate and quality, track blood oxygen saturation, look for blood and saliva as evidence of pulmonary hemorrhage, initiate shock treatment even without visible bleeding. Every item on that list traces directly back to the autopsies conducted on First World War soldiers who appeared uninjured. What hasn't changed is the underlying physics. Modern body armor is remarkable technology, ceramic strike plates and high tensile fiber layers that reliably stop rifle rounds and fragmentation. Against a blast wave, they are functionally transparent. The pressure doesn't interact with a ceramic plate the way a bullet does. It moves around it, through it, into the body behind it. A soldier in the most capable protective equipment available today can still die from blast lung if the detonation is close enough. The only thing that provides meaningful protection is distance, enough of it that the wave has spread and weakened before reaching the body. Combat doesn't always offer that. What has changed is the understanding. Military medicine now recognizes that a soldier standing upright, speaking coherently, showing no wounds, can be dying from injuries that are destroying his organs from the inside. That recognition, built from autopsies, animal studies, post-war research programs, and cumulative clinical experience across multiple conflicts, is what converts a death in a field trench into a survival long enough to reach a hospital with the tools to intervene. The physics itself is identical to what it was in 1916. A blast wave moves faster through tissue than through air. It compresses air-filled organs violently, while surrounding tissue remains rigid. It tears alveolar membranes at pressure boundaries, floods lungs with blood, bruises intestinal walls, and drives intracranial pressure up inside a sealed skull. The mechanism that killed men along the Somme operates by exactly the same rules in every conflict fought since. The only meaningful evolution is what happens to the casualty in the minutes and hours that follow, whether anyone around him recognizes what they're looking at, and whether there is anything available to slow the cascade until he reaches care that can address it. All of that knowledge came from the bodies of men found dead in their positions, unmarked, destroyed from the inside by a wall of compressed air that arrived before any warning and hit harder than any living tissue was ever built to absorb.